Hi everyone, welcome back to the channel. My name is Pooja and this is my channel Ready Set Pooja. If you are coming back to the channel, thanks so much for coming back. And if you're new here, thanks so much for stopping on by. Before we get started with today's video, just want to say I am super excited about the fact that I have crossed 100 subscribers. It's so cool that there's over 100 people watching these videos, and I'm glad that hopefully the things that I have to say bring you a bit of joy. Thank you so much to everyone who's taken the time out of their day to watch these videos, and I am excited to continue making more. So for today's video, I am going to be talking about my May wrap-up. Now, May was a pretty busy month for me. As you can see, my background is different, so I did move in May, so that's cool. I'm in a new apartment now, and I finally have an actual bookshelf background. Hopefully this will get a lot more populated as time goes on, but right now it's pretty sparse. I left many of my books back at my parents' house, and so in my apartment right now I only kind of brought the essentials, books that I really wanted on my shelf and books that I am currently or planning to read soon or shortly. So yeah, I can do maybe like a bookshelf tour at some point. I know those are pretty popular. But anyway, let's get down to the books that I read in May. If you've watched the past couple videos on this channel, you'll know that in May I was participating in the Asian readathon run by With Cindy, so most of the books that I read in May ended up being by Asian or Asian American authors, which I tend to do a good amount of anyway, so it didn't feel like any super different or anything like that, but just like all of these books are by Asian authors that I'm going to talk about today, so there's that. If you've seen the Asian Readathon video, you'll know that there were 4 books included in that. I did actually read 3 of them, and the last one I read part of, so I'll talk about that one first. So that was Paavsaadhicha Paus, which is a Marathi collection of short stories by Shanta Shelke. As I mentioned in my Asian Readathon TBR video, that was definitely the biggest challenge for me this month, reading in a language that I am not super comfortable in, but it was a lot of fun and it was a cool thing to do reading out loud with my parents, and they would help me out with certain words that I didn't know, and it was just a fun experience to share with them. So I did read I would say about half the book. I read about 7 or 8 stories in there, and it was a really enjoyable experience, but I did not finish the entire thing, and I do think it's going to take me quite a while to get through the whole thing, and it's something that I enjoy doing with my parents, so now that I'm not, living with them anymore, it's something that I'll probably pick up with the next time I'm home and just kind of do that for the next few trips that I make home, and slowly get to the finish line on that book. But anyways, that's that one. And then the other books, so one book that I mentioned, which was the nonfiction book, was The Rumi Prescription by Melody Moezzi. This book actually, and one other book, which is The Wild Fox of Yemen by Threa Almontaser, who is a Yemeni American poet, and so this was a collection of poetry. Both of those I actually had gotten from the library in the town where my parents live, and so I had to return both of those books before I moved to where I currently am right now. And so I filmed my little review of those 2 books in advance, so I will just stick that in here and I will see you in a couple minutes. Hi everybody, this is Pooja from the past, looking a bit ratchet because I've been running errands all day, but I actually have to return a couple of books to the library, but I did want to include them in my May wrap-up, so we're just going to talk about them really quickly before I have to do that, and then we can go back to the normal Pooja from the future who is actually doing a May wrap-up. So let's jump right into it. The first book is The Wild Fox of Yemen by Threa Almontaser, hopefully I pronounced that correctly, who is a Yemeni American author, actually a poet, and this is just a collection of her poems. I found this to be a really interesting collection that really examines what it means to be a Muslim American, and how she has kind of delved with the issues that result from having that particular identity. I found it to be a really illuminating analysis of very just sort of basic things that happen in daily life as a result of having an identity that is often ostracized in popular culture and mainstream culture, and what it feels like to grow up in that community where you don't necessarily feel accepted in the broader context of America. And I thought the way she writes about it is just absolutely stunning and very visceral language that really kind of helps you feel what it's like to be going through these life experiences. So I found this to be an absolutely fascinating collection of poems, and it's quite short, as you can see, but one that I found myself often coming back to a couple of days later, just because I found them to be so interesting. And I wrote down several of these poems in my journal because I just found them to be something that really stuck with me. So I would highly recommend this collection of poems. The second book that I now have to return to the library is The Rumi Prescription by Melody Moezzi, which was part of my Asian readathon picks as a nonfiction book. So this is a sort of memoir that Melody Moezzi, who is an author, activist, lawyer of Iranian-American descent, and she basically has gone through a lot with relation to mental health and suffers from bipolar disorder, and has obviously, gone through all of the sort of psychiatric treatments in relation to that, been through all of the medical interventions and things like that. And this is a story of how she and her father reconnect over the poetry of Rumi, and how she's able to use that poetry to actually find some peace in her own mind and feel a bit more, just like she has come to terms with her life. So I found this to be a really interesting analysis of Rumi's poetry, a really interesting way of thinking about, okay, how does this poetry actually relate to the life of an actual reader? And the way that she kind of goes through it, how this poetry has such a visceral effect on her and the people around her. I thought it was really interesting because it feels like you're listening to someone talk like they would in a booktube video about how a certain story or collection of poems or whatever it may be had an effect on their life. And I found this to be a really interesting analysis of, one, what it's like to live with a mental illness, and then two, how things from our cultures can actually serve as a means of comfort as we try to navigate these modern, just craziness that happens in life for many of us. So I think that, even if you don't have a diagnosed or clinical mental illness or something like that, I think all of us have something to learn from how she was able to use Rumi's poetry as sort of a conduit for finding just some more peace and comfort in her life. So found this to be a really interesting analysis. Loved this book. So yeah, I really enjoyed this one, and now I'm about to head to the library, return these books, and I will let you guys go ahead and go back to Puja of today. All right, bye. And we are back. Okay, cool. So those were those two books. And then the next thing that I wanted to talk about was a book that I read called The Vegetarian by Han Kang. Again, this was one I mentioned for my Asian Readathon TBR. This is a very critically acclaimed, popular book. I believe it won the International Booker Prize, so very well known. Han Kang is a South Korean author, and the book is based in South Korea. It takes place in South Korea. I think it was originally written in Korean, but has been translated to English. And this book was crazy. It was like such a surreal novel to read, and a really thought-provoking one. So essentially our main character starts having a bit of an existential crisis about the food that she's consuming and wants to go vegetarian because she doesn't want to cause harm to animals and things like that. For, reasons that many people go vegetarian. At first, it all seems very innocuous, but it does disturb her family quite a bit because eating meat is a big part of their familial culture. But at first, it doesn't seem so bad, but it starts to kind of go along this slippery slope where she kind of stops eating altogether and starts getting very sick, and they're all really worried about her. And the interesting thing about how this book was set up was that it was told in 3 parts. One is by our main character's husband, from his point of view. One is from the point of view of her brother-in-law, who actually has some lustful feelings for her. And then the final chapter is from the point of view of her sister. So the interesting thing is that you never actually hear the main character's perspective on what is happening to her, and you kind of hear it only from the perspective of others around her. And so the interesting thing about having every perspective essentially but hers was that it really kind of calls to light the question, are these other characters just projecting their own neuroses and insecurities on our main character, or is something actually really wrong with her. I think my personal conclusion was that, yeah, she had definitely taken the vegetarianism had turned into somewhat of a mental illness and was seriously affecting her physical health as well. But it was really interesting to explore this descent of our character from the perspectives of 3 of the characters around her. So I thought that was a really interesting way it was set up. The writing was stunning. It was really, really surreal and really kind of draws you in, and actually made me like get kind of stressed out in some parts, which I think was the effect that it was looking for. So it's very, very provocative and thought-provoking writing. So would highly recommend. It's also a pretty short book, so it doesn't take too long to get through, but is one that really, really sticks with you and really calls to light a lot of questions about how we interact with others in society who may have lifestyles or belief systems that differ from our own. And then the final thing that I read this month is actually 3 books, which was the Poppy War trilogy, which is surprisingly the only books that I actually have. So I have the first 2 books of the Poppy War trilogy here, The Poppy War and The Dragon Republic. I also read the 3rd book, The Burning God, but I read that on ebook from Libby because I was actually just waiting to get paperback editions of all 3 of them. Side note, I know on booktube the paperbacks of the Poppy War trilogy are not super popular. Like, people hate the fact that these are orange and blue, and the hardback versions are, I think, this beautiful white, and people really, really like those. But I kind of like these. I think it's like a pop of color on my bookshelf. And yeah, I don't really mind it, and I definitely prefer having paperbacks to hardbacks. As you can see, there's a lot of paperbacks on this bookshelf. So I don't know, I didn't have a problem with them, and I really like how they look, so I'm just going to wait for the 3rd one to come out. I believe it comes out in November, and then I will complete my ownership of the trilogy. But anyway, enough about the covers, and I'll talk about the actual book. So Poppy War trilogy has been super popular on booktube. I feel like I'm one of the last people who's actually read it. For those of you who don't know, the Poppy War trilogy was written by Rebecca Kuang, who, side note, is a supremely talented human being, and I am just in awe of her. I think we're like the same age. Like, I'm gonna turn 24 soon, and I'm pretty sure she's like either the same age or maybe a year older than me, and it's insane to me that she wrote such a stunning, gripping series at such a young age. I believe she started work on the Poppy War at like 18 or 19 or something. So it's really an achievement, I would say, to have written something so dark and something that really grasps the realities of a subject as difficult to encompass as war in such a young age. So kudos to her for coming up with this series. But anyway, so the Poppy War trilogy follows our main character, Rin, who lives in this fantasy world that is inspired by China in the 1900s. She lives in the southern part of the Nicara Empire, which is where this whole thing takes place. And she's kind of this peasant girl who doesn't really have many options ahead of her, and she is actually a war orphan from the Poppy Wars that had taken place many years ago, and a family had been forced to adopt her, and they're kind of abusive, and they plan to marry her off to a rich person that is in the town. She really doesn't want to do that because she's very, very headstrong, so she sees an escape route in taking an exam to be accepted into the Nicara Empire's military academy, Sign Guard. I don't know if I'm pronouncing all these things right. But she eventually is successful in that exam, goes off to Sign Guard, and there then begins her journey into becoming eventually a military commander for the Nicara Empire. And then a whole lot of other stuff happens involving lots of politics between the leaders of the Nicara Empire, the Hesperians, who are basically the like Western white people stand-ins in this fantasy world, and then the Mugen Federation, who essentially represent the Japanese. This trilogy is really stunning for a couple of reasons. One, it really darkly embodies what war is like. It doesn't brush over anything. There are several scenes that really just make you gasp. And honestly, going in, I thought this was going to be like a young adult fantasy. It is not that. It is very dark. It is very grim. There's literally depictions of people eating corpses because there's no other food that they can eat. It is very, very difficult to read in some parts, and Rebecca Kuang does not, does not cut us any slack. She is like, war sucks for everyone involved. It is a horrible, horrible, horrible thing, and everyone involved in it is going to suffer so much, and that is something that she does not shy away from at all. The climactic event of the Poppy War, the first book, is based on the rape of Nanjing, which is a horrific historical event that happened during World War II when the Japanese were occupying China. I personally did not know a lot about the rape of Nanjing before reading this book, and I still want to educate myself more on it. And Rebecca Kuang actually does leave a few nonfiction recommendations at the back of the book to learn more about these historical events that inspired what happened in this book. But I did read about it on the internet, and it's something that isn't really taught that much in American schools. Like, we think about World War II as something that primarily happened in Europe. And we hear about kind of, things were happening in other parts of the world, but it's not really emphasized. And there were these horrific events that were happening in other parts of the world that all of us need to understand and learn about just as much as we should be learning about horrific things that happened in Europe. So I think the fact that she has written something that has probably brought this event to light for many people for perhaps the first time, I think is also a very commendable achievement. The second thing that I really liked about this book was how well developed the characters were. I will say that Rin is a very unlikable protagonist. It makes a lot of decisions that I would not make, and makes a lot of decisions that kind of make her a bad person. To be honest, there are some situations where she's just really selfish. She doesn't do the right thing. She really gets taken over by her emotions, but it also makes her a very realistic protagonist, someone that you can empathize with even if you disagree with some of their actions. I also love all of the other characters. Neza is an amazingly written character. Kite is an amazingly written character. It's such a brilliant character study that she's done. And then finally, the politics are written so well. It's so interesting, sort of the intricacies that have to be considered when you're making these big political decisions. And honestly, it feels like Kuang was like, I don't know, has decades of experience as like a statesman or something like that. And it doesn't feel like she's like my age, and like has such a good understanding of what politics and war can really be like. It's seriously such an amazing series. I would highly recommend to anyone interested in fantasy and those kinds of books at all. You should definitely read it. And yeah, that was my May wrap up. Those are all the books that I read in May. I think it was a pretty good reading month. I read 6 books. So even though I was like moving and like a lot of different stuff was happening in my personal life, I think it was a pretty good month for me in terms of reading. So excited for June, summer. And I know that in many parts of the world, COVID is still such a, horrific thing that's kind of going around and affecting a lot of people. Where I live, things are loosening up a lot. Many of us have been vaccinated, which I'm very thankful for, and different places that we can go to are opening up. I'm actually back at work as well, so it kind of feels like things are slowly crawling their way back to normal. And this might be a summer that we can start to enjoy where I live. So that I'm very grateful for and thankful for, but recognize that in many parts of the world that's not the case. So if you are still being affected by this pandemic in a pretty serious way, my thoughts are with you. Hopefully the whole world can pull through this sooner rather than later. But yeah, that's all I will leave you guys with today. So thanks so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I'll see you next time. Bye bye.